Hi everyone, my name is Jennifer Urist, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the TCE water contamination in Woburn, Massachusetts. So to begin, I will start with the purpose and objectives, followed by what happened in Woburn, followed by the TCE concentrations in wells G and H, followed by the health impact, economic impact, environmental impact, and then provide a summary and references. So let's get started. So the purpose of this presentation is to understand the background of the Woburn TCE water contamination event. And following this presentation, I hope to meet the objectives of demonstrating the health, environmental, and economical impacts of TCE exposure in Woburn, and also discuss the cleanup and implications of this event. So what happened in Woburn? In Woburn, wells G and H provided about 30% of the water supply for residents from 1964 to 1979. And during this time, many residents complained about the taste, the smell, and even the color of their water. But nothing was done. The water was deemed safe to consume at this time. Also during this time, 12 cases of childhood leukemia were reported in Woburn, and 6 of these cases were reported within the same 6-block region of Woburn that was serviced by wells G and H. Well, as it turns out, in May 1979, the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection detected contaminants in wells G and H. For the purpose of this presentation, we will be focusing on TCE, trichloroethylene, but these other contaminants were also found in wells G and H. How did the contaminants get there? Well, it was suspected that nearby industrial properties had improperly disposed of toxic waste. Many of them were industrial plants that used TCE, which is a degreasing solvent, and these contaminants leaked from the plants into the water supply and the Aberjona River, which flows through these wells, which I will show on the next slide. So as you can see here in figure 1, this is a spatial map of wells G and H alongside the 3 industrial plants that were suspected of contaminating these wells. So on the left you can see Beatrice, on the top you have UniFirst and W.R. Grace, and these were the suspected sources of contamination for wells G and H. And this is taken from the EPA in 1990. So just how much TCE was in these wells? Well, at the initial reading on May 14th in 1979, well G contained well over 250 parts per million of TCE, while H had right below 200 parts per million. Once the wells were stopped and shut down, you can see measurements were taken again on September 24th of the same year, and contamination or TCE concentration went down, but the upper limit set by the EPA of TCE, is 0.005 parts per million, making this a serious contamination concern. And what about the health impacts? As you can see here, I bring your attention to the all ages group. This is a table that points out childhood leukemia cases in Woburn from 1969 to 1979. There were 12 cases of childhood leukemia reported during this time, but the expected number of cases was 5.3. And this data was adopted from a study conducted by Parker and Rosen in 1981, and they found this to be significant with a p-value of 0.008. If you look at the distribution by gender, male and female, you can see that more cases of childhood leukemia were observed than expected. So this raised concerns of whether these leukemia cases were related to the TCE in the water supply. And if we look at this temporally over time, that is, in figure 4, this is a line graph that demonstrates the observed and expected number of deaths from leukemia in children from 1949 all the way through 1978. You can see that in 1964, when Wells G and H were introduced, childhood leukemia is observed in greater number than the expected amount. In 1969 to 1973, this flips by a small margin, but then from 1974 through 1978, you can see that the observed number of deaths versus the expected number of deaths skyrockets. And this is proposed to be because of the latency period of leukemia, meaning that it's a disease that takes time to develop. So between 1964, when the wells and the water supplies were first introduced into Woburn, the cancer would develop over time and first start presenting itself around the 1974 time period. What about the economic impact? So once the well was shut down in 1979, cleanup had to occur, and cleanup turned out to be an incredibly costly event. The total amount spent was $19.1 million, and as you can see by this pie chart, 54% of that money was spent on soil excavation, offsite disposal, capping, and institutional controls. The point of this is to make clear that this was a costly event. TCE contamination is detrimental to people, and it's also very difficult to clean up. This cleanup occurred after Wells G and H were declared as a Superfund site, which I will talk about in the next slide. So this is a timeline of the changes that occurred. So as I spoke about earlier, 1979 was when Wells G and H were shut down and the EPA investigation of contamination began. In 1983, the site was put on the national priorities list. In 1989, cleanup activities began. So that is when all the money that I spoke about on the previous slide began being funneled into clean up the site, so removing debris, sediment, the soil treatment, and also clearing the groundwater and conducting treatment to remove contaminants. Over time, the area developed, and as you can see in the early 2000s, the first new building was placed, the Holland Ice Rink Arena. And then after a couple more years, the area continued to be developed. And now you can see from this picture, there is a hotel, a Chick-fil-A, and a few more restaurants in the area, as well as an industrial park in the back. And throughout all of this, maintenance of the area and also testing continues to occur to ensure that the area is safe and there are no contaminants in the water. So finally, to sum up this presentation, the residents of Woburn, Massachusetts had concerns about their water supply long before the EPA discovered TCE in their water. They had aesthetic concerns, which turned out to actually be health hazard concerns, as we learned in class. Sometimes aesthetic concerns bring forth health concerns. The childhood leukemia cases in Woburn present a strong case for why TCE exposure can be associated with the development of cancer. And I'm not going to ruin the book, but I highly recommend reading A Civil Action. This talks about this in much further detail than I can do in this presentation. And ultimately, the cleanup efforts for Wells G and H were very costly events. $19.1 million were spent. And as the area continues to redevelop, surveillance and maintenance of testing continues to occur. These are the references, and thank you for listening.